promising more and spending more than it takes in over time. It slows the economy. It piles up the interest payments. It shrinks the amount of money available for essential services, and it puts the programs that were in place in real jeopardy. So if we look at that, we clearly have to answer the question, where do we go from here, and how do we go forward in a constructive way? I would suggest a few things. First, we need to enforce the law that's there. The law that is in place, on the books now. Even though I believe that law designs a process that is woefully short of where we need to go, at least it is a step in the right direction, and we need to enforce that. No one wanted to get to this across-the-board cutting, this sequester that impacts our national security, particularly, and other functions of government. That was supposed to prevent us from, or provide a basis for us to come to agreement. It didn't. But that now is the law. And attempts to undo that, I think, is one of the most cynical things we could do. And the American people know it. And I don't believe they'll allow us to do it. So the law needs to be enforced in terms of the minimal amount of cuts that we've already agreed to need to take place, and we need to go forward and do that. So there are a number of ways, and I commend the committee for at least trying to come up with some efficiencies and effectiveness in our federal spending process, and that they have, I believe they have a list of things that we can look to in order to enforce more cuts. I have suggested a triage process when we review every aspect of an agency of government, every function that's performed with this, through this federal government, and basically say we've got a patient here that's sick, a patient here with a potentially terminal disease, but we need to triage, and we've got a bunch of people in the waiting room. Some of them need attention right away. And so triaging results in every agency, every function, every expenditure being examined from the standpoint of, is this absolutely essential to the future of this country, to the protection of our citizens? Is this an absolutely essential function of government that can't be done at the state level, at the local level, or at the private level? And if so, then that needs to have priority. Secondly, there's a whole range of issues. We come down here every day with new ideas and thoughts of nice to do, but we can't afford to do. And we have to postpone those or just simply say to people, I'm sorry, we don't have the money to do it. And if we don't have the money to do it, we shouldn't do it now. So we separate the essential from the like to do, it can't do, and then we look at what do we really need to do that someone else can do better. Whether it's in the private sector, whether it's at the state level, whether it's at the local level, there's a whole range of things where the federal government has gotten way in over its head. And these are functions and things that can take place through the private sector or through state and local governments that we don't need to do. We can look at the duplication and inefficiencies that exist here. Senator Coburn came up with a long list, trillions of dollars of expenditures that could be saved. We ought to look at that. We ought to look at those and decide which ones we want to go forward with and how we can start that process. He talked about duplication. Just let me mention a couple things here. 18 separate domestic food assistance programs. Do we need a domestic assistance for food? Oh, probably there's some areas where we do. Do we need 18 separate programs doling this out? 47 different job training programs. Okay. The economy is restructuring. We need job training. Do we need 47 separate programs to do that? And my personal favorite, 56 financial literacy programs. You could argue that the federal government is in no place to have one financial literacy program in place to go out and teach the American people how to be financially literate. I think what we need to do is be financially literate here, and then use that model to show people how to be literate rather than simply saying, well, we've got the answer. We obviously don't have the answer, and why we have 56 financial literacy programs in place through this federal government is just astounding. So these are suggestions, and there's many others regarding cutting of spending. But there are other functions here that need to be addressed in three major categories. One is regulatory reform. It's costing the American taxpayer and Americans millions and billions of dollars of regulatory measures that are coming out of the various agencies without a solid cost-benefit basis attached to it, without solid assessments based, and there's a process underway to look at those. That's one category. I could talk a long time about that. I won't. A second one is entitlement reform. Now, I've been talking about that from the beginning. This is the engine that drives the train of deficit. And we can either stand by and continue to lie to the American people and say you've got nothing to worry about. We're going to preserve every penny of the Social Security program and every penny of the Medicare and Medicaid programs. It'll always be there for you. Don't worry. Even the money that you put in payroll taxes and so forth, it's all sacrosanct and don't worry about it. We can continue that lie, or we can tell them the truth. And that is, if we want to keep these programs viable, we need to take structural reform measures now. That could be increasing the age of eligibility for Medicare to coincide with the age that is currently available for Social Security. That could be changes in some of the indexes that are used to calculate the cost of living adjustments. That could be changed, that could be modified through means testing. Warren Buffett says he doesn't need Social Security. Fine. If people in that category don't need Social Security or Medicare or at least the full payment, let's give them back what they paid in. But as most people don't understand, the average American is receiving 3 times as much in their lifetime as from what they paid in as to what they are receiving. So we could put some means testing in there. We need to debate and talk about this. Politically sensitive? Sure. But let's be honest with the American people. They want us to be honest. I think that's what the message of 2010 was all about. And the third category, one in which I've been very involved in, is reforming our tax code, which is a mess. It's a complexity that's totally incomprehensible to anybody who spends less than 15 hours a day as a career studying the tax code and trying to figure out how all these things work together. It's a nightmare. Americans spend billions of dollars paying people to do their taxes because they can't figure it out themselves. There's a complexity after complexity and thousands and tens of thousands of pages in this tax code. There is a consensus that we need to reform our tax code. And it's a bipartisan consensus. Senator Wyden and I have a bill. It has been worked on for 3 years. It is not the absolute answer to everything, but it's in text, and it's been scored, and it's available to be a base of which to go forward on. And I know that the Super Committee looked at that. And I think the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee ought to look at that. Tax reform can produce revenues for this country and growth for this country, which will give us a growing economy, a growing GDP, and help with our fiscal situation. Mr. President, I sense that I'm close to or running out of time, and in deference to my colleagues, let me just wrap up if I could. I came here deeply disappointed. I remain deeply disappointed that we haven't been able to do more. My number one priority has been to advocate for going big. We weren't able to do that. Experts agree we must do more. All we have to do is look at Europe to see what's coming next. Let's try to avoid that. There are plans out there that we can build off of. So instead of just folding our tent and saying there's nothing we can do except waiting for the election results of 2012 and maybe we'll have a different president or a different Congress or whatever, we have a responsibility to act and to act now. There are ways we can do this. We need to demonstrate to ourselves and to the American people that we will take up the responsibility. I choose to do that. I choose to make the tough decisions. I choose to take the tough medicine for the future of this country, and I believe the American people choose also. And with that, I urge my colleagues to join me as we go forward to finishing out this year and going forward in the year ahead, not sitting back and waiting for election results. Let's do something now, because the urgency and the crisis is now, and it needs to be addressed. Let's be responsible, step up, and do it. Mr. President, with that, I yield back.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I rise today along with my colleague, my fellow University of Georgia graduate, Senator Isaacson, to honor a man who died last week, who became a legend in his own time in our great state. A legend that was respected by, as we would say, folks on both sides of the aisle. This man, that term to this man means that he was respected by Georgia Tech football fans as well as University of Georgia football fans. The man I'm talking about is Larry Munson. Larry Munson was not a Southerner by birth, but he became a Southerner and a Georgia Bulldog by passion. He was the Georgia football announcer for in excess of 4 decades, and during those 4 decades, he not only witnessed some of the most memorable football games, but he made some of the most memorable calls. His way of describing a football play will go down in the annals of broadcasting as not only being unique, not only being fascinating, but it'll go down in the annals of sports broadcasting as being some of the best and most professional calls ever made on a football field. But there was more to Larry Munson than the run, Lindsey, run. More to Larry Munson than the OU Herschel Walker. More to Larry Munson than we just stomped on him with our hobnail boot. He was a man who had passion for life, a man who had a thorough understanding of his profession, a man who worked very hard at his profession. He used to get up every Saturday morning before a football game and have coffee with our legendary coach, Vince Dooley. Coach Dooley said that he finally had to stop having coffee with Larry Munson because Larry was the ever pessimist from a football standpoint, and that Coach Dooley would come into those coffees feeling good about his chances in the ball game that day, and by the time he finished having coffee with Larry Munson, he had to go back and rewrite his playbook for the ball game. Larry Munson was simply a man who loved the University of Georgia. He loved calling football games, and he loved putting his emotions into those calls. He was a man also who cared not just about the University of Georgia, but about its students. He used to have what he called a Wednesday night movie night, where he would invite students to join him at a theater in Athens, Georgia, and he would just share time, his time, with students that he loved. And he did this for years and years and years. And I've heard stories from some of those folks who attended those movie nights that Larry Munson was more passionate about movies than he was about University of Georgia football, which is hard to imagine. But as we look back on the life of Larry Munson, those of us who live and breathe Georgia football will always remember the passionate calls, the way that he put his heart and soul into a football game, but we'll also remember the man, Larry Munson, who enjoyed life, enjoyed people, enjoyed his profession, and who gave so much back to his profession, and a man who loved the outdoors. He came from his birthplace of Minneapolis South many years ago, and he remained a true Southerner, not just for his 40 years of broadcasting at the University of Georgia, but in his bass fishing, for example. I remember when he would come down to our part of the world in South Georgia to speak to a touchdown club or whatever it may be, he would always call up and say, "Where's the best bass pond in South Georgia? That's where I want to be this afternoon before my speech." And he just thoroughly enjoyed the outdoors, thoroughly enjoyed being around people, and that was obvious in the way he expressed himself behind the microphone when he called football games. So as we celebrate the life of Larry Munson, we celebrate more than his historic calls, his passion for football, his passion for his family, his passion for friends, exceeds any passion he had for football. And Larry Munson was a great man. He was a great friend. He is certainly going to be missed by our state and particularly by our university. With that, I would yield to Senator Isaacson.
Chambliss, for the opportunity to share a few moments.
Senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm honored to share a few moments with Senator Chambliss on the floor of the Senate, pay tribute to a great Georgia legend, Larry Munson. Larry Munson was born in Minneapolis, as Senator Chambliss said, and after the service got a scholarship for broadcasting school and got his first job at the University of Wyoming calling their football games. He worked his way to Tennessee, where he was the announcer for the Vanderbilt basketball program and the Vanderbilt football program. And then when the Atlanta Braves moved from Milwaukee to Atlanta, Larry Munson was brought in to be one of the announcers for Atlanta Braves baseball. Shortly after that, Ed Thelanious, the voice of the Georgia Bulldogs for years, retired, went to another job, and Larry Munson was asked to take over broadcasting at the University of Georgia. He was a Yankee, an outsider, not one that many people thought much of when he started. But he became a legend in his time and is a revered person in our state. You know, Mr. President, it's said that the Southeastern Conference football is not a game, it's a religion. And in that analogy, if it's a religion in the Southeastern Conference, Larry Munson was the high priest. He was the man that everybody looked to make the call that nobody else could. Greatest tribute I ever saw to Larry Munson was on SEC football on Saturday afternoon at 3:30 when a couple of years ago, before he retired, the announcers for CBS television brought in Larry Munson's radio play-by-play and set themselves aside because he was that good. He brought the game to life. He brought a spirit to the game that you just couldn't find. And he was a homer. He was a hometown boy. There was no question who he worked for, no question who signed his ticket. He was always fair, but he was always friendly to the dogs. It was his spirit that brought the University of Georgia from the doldrums of the 1960s to the heights of college football, the national championship in 1980, 4 SEC championships in the last 12 years, and hopefully an SEC championship this Saturday night. Larry Munson passed away a few days before Thanksgiving in his beloved town and hometown of Athens, Georgia. Though he started in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and went to Wyoming and later to Tennessee, he finally resided in Georgia, he died in Georgia, and he is esteemed in our state. So on this day, let me, on behalf of the people I represent in my state, of all persuasions when it comes to college football, pay tribute to a man that gave every single measure of himself to make sure that every single person who listened to his voice saw a game whether they were blind or whether they could see, because he brought life to a game that nobody else could. Larry Munson was a great Georgian, a great American. He will be missed, but I can promise you this. His view of Sanford Stadium today is far better than the view he used to have in the broadcast booth, because he's very high over a stadium he loved, a stadium where he made his living, and a stadium where he will always be remembered. And I yield back the balance of my time. And note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
you. ask consent to terminate the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
I believe we're still in morning business.
Senator is correct.
Okay, I would ask consent to enter into a colloquy for, can you let me know when 10 minutes has expired?
Without objection.
Thank you. While we decide how we're going to move on the defense bill, Senator Kyle, I appreciate you coming to the floor. You and I, along with Senator Levin McCain, been working on detainee policy for years now. And there's an issue that's before the Senate here soon. It involves what to do with an American citizen who is suspected of collaborating with al-Qaeda or an affiliated group. Do you agree with me, Senator Kyle, that in other wars, American citizens unfortunately have aided the enemies of their time?
Mr. President, yes, I would say to my colleagues, unfortunately it's the case that there probably hasn't been a major conflict in which at least some American citizen has decided to leave his country and side with the enemy.
Are you familiar with the efforts by German saboteurs who landed, I believe, in the Long Island area? I don't know exactly where they landed during World War II, and they were aided by American citizens to execute a sabotage plot against the United States?
Yeah, Mr. President, yes. And in fact, there is a famous U.S. Supreme Court case, Ex parte Quirin, decided in 1942 that dealt with the issue of an American citizen helping the Nazis, the Nazi saboteurs that came to our shores.
Do you agree with me that our Supreme Court ruled then that when an American citizen decides to collaborate and assist a enemy force, that that's viewed as an act of war and the law of war applies to the conduct of the American citizen?
Mr. President, I'd say to my colleague, yes. My colleague knows this case. I am confident. And I think one quotation from the case makes the point clearly. In Ex parte Quirin, the court made clear, and I'm quoting now, citizenship in the United States of an enemy belligerent does not relieve him from the consequences of his belligerency, end of quote. In other words, if you leave your country and take the position contrary, you side with the enemy, you become a belligerent against the United States, the fact that you're still a citizen does not protect you from being captured, being held, and in this case even being tried by a military tribunal.
So the law, at least since 1942 by the Supreme Court, has been that if you decide as an American citizen to join forces with enemies of the United States, you have committed an act of war against your fellow citizens. It's not a criminal event we're investigating or dealing with. It's an act of war, and the American citizens who helped the Nazis were held as enemy combatants and tried as enemy combatants.
Mr. President, yes, I would just qualify that statement this way. One can be subject to military custody, being a belligerent against the United States, even while being a U.S. citizen, be tried by military commission because of the act of war against the United States that you committed. One could also theoretically have been tried in a criminal court. But one can't reach the opposite conclusion, which is that you can only be tried in civilian court.
Okay, now, in the Military Commission Act of 2009, we prohibited American citizens from being tried by military commissions, and I'm okay with that. But what we have not done, and I would be very upset if we chose to do that, is take off the table the ability to interrogate an American citizen who has chosen to help al-Qaeda regarding what they know about the enemy and what intelligence they may provide us to prevent a future attack. So since homegrown terrorism is a growing threat, under the current law, if an American citizen became radical, went to Pakistan and trained with al-Qaeda or an affiliated group, flew back to Dulles Airport, got off the plane, got a rifle, went down to the mall right behind us and started shooting people, do you agree with me that under the law as it exists today, that person could be held as an enemy combatant? That person could be interrogated by our military and intelligence community, and we could hold them as long as necessary to find out what they know about any future attacks or any past attacks, and we don't have to read them their Miranda rights?
Mr. President, yes. The answer to the question short is yes. It's confirmed by the fact that in the Hamdi case, the United States Supreme Court precisely held that that detention would be lawful, and of course, with the detention being lawful, the interrogation, to which my colleague refers, could also be taken place.
The Senator yield for a question on that specific point.
The senator from Arizona is recognized.
The individual who was an American citizen, Mr. Hamdan, subject to the United States Supreme Court case, was an American citizen captured in Afghanistan, right? Is that correct? And yet, in the Supreme Court decision, reference is made to an individual who was captured during World War II in the United States of America. Isn't that correct? It was referenced in the Supreme Court decision.
The N. Ray Curran case dealt with an American citizen helping the Nazis in America. The Hamdi case dealt with an American citizen helping the Taliban in Afghanistan.
The reason why I raise the question is because the senator from Illinois and others have cited the fact that Hamdan was an American citizen but captured in Afghanistan, not in the United States of America. Yet isn't it a fact that the decision in Hamdan also made reference to a person who was apprehended in the United States of America? This is what's really bizarre about this discussion, it seems to me.
Senator McCain, the Hamdi case cited N. Ray Curran for the proposition that an American citizen who provides aid, comfort, or collaboration with the enemy can be held as an enemy combatant. The N. Ray Curran case dealt with an American citizen helping the Nazis in New York. And the Padilla case involves an American citizen collaborating with al-Qaeda captured in the United States.
The question is, it is irrelevant where the citizen of the United States was captured, because the decision made reference to people captured both in the United States and outside the United States.
Exactly, and I would add, and get Senator Kyle's comment, wouldn't it be an absurd result if you can kill an American citizen abroad, al-Awlaki, whatever his name was. The president targeted him for assassination because he was an American citizen who went to Yemen to engage in an act of terrorism against the United States. And the president went through an executive legal process, targeted him for assassination, and a drone attack killed him, and we're all better off. Because when an American citizen helps the enemy, they're no longer just a common criminal. They're a military threat, and they should be dealt with appropriately. But my point is, wouldn't it be an odd result to have a law set up so that if you actually got to America and you tried to kill our people here on our own soil, all of a sudden you have criminal status? I would argue that the homeland is part of the battlefield, and we should protect the homeland above anything else. So it would be crazy to have a law that says if you went to Pakistan and attacked an American soldier, you could be blown up or held indefinitely, but if you made it back to Dulles Airport, you went downtown and started killing Americans randomly, we couldn't hold you and gather intelligence. The Supreme Court in 1942 said that made no sense. A person helping the Nazis, if a senator in 1942 took the floor of the United States Senate and said, you know, those American citizens who collaborated with the Nazis, we ought not treat them as an enemy, you'd be run out of town. I'm just saying to any American citizen, if you want to help al-Qaeda, you do so at your own peril. You can get killed in the process. You can get detained indefinitely, and when you're being questioned by the CIA, the FBI, or the Department of Defense about where you trained and what you did and what you know, and you say to the interrogator, I want my lawyer, the interrogator will say, you don't have a right to a lawyer because you're a military threat. We're not this is not Dragnet. We're fighting a war. And the Supreme Court of the United States has clearly said that an American citizen who joins with the enemy has committed an act of war. And Senator Feinstein, who's the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, is a very good senator. But her concerns about holding an American citizen under the law of war, her amendment, unfortunately, would change the law. Do you agree with that, Senator Kyle?
Yes. Mr. President, and that's the key point here. There is a reason why you don't want to adopt the Feinstein Amendment. It would preclude us from gaining all of the intelligence that we could gain by interrogating the individual who has turned on his own country and who would have knowledge of others who might have joined him in that effort or other plans that might be underway. We know from past experience that this interrogation can lead to other information to save American lives by preventing future attacks, and it's occurred time and time again. And in a moment I'll put a statement in the record that details a lot of this intelligence that we've gathered. And it's not as if an American citizen doesn't have the habeas corpus protection, which still attaches, whether or not that individual is taken into military custody. So the basic constitutional right of an American citizen is preserved, and yet the government's ability to interrogate and gain intelligence is also preserved by the existing law, by the status of the law as it exists today. And we would not want to change that law by something like the Feinstein Amendment.
Simply stated, when you decided to help the Nazis, the American Citizens Question decided to give aid and comfort to the Nazis, I am very glad they were allowed to be held by our military and interrogated about the plot and what they knew, because intelligence gathering is the best way to keep us safe. And I would be just absolutely devastated if the Senate, for the first time in 2011, denied the ability of our military and intelligence community to interrogate somebody that came back from Pakistan and started killing people on the mall, that you could no longer hold them as an enemy combatant and find out what they did and why they did it, that you would have to treat them as a common criminal reading them their Miranda rights. That is not the law. If that becomes the law, then we're less safe, because I tell you, as we speak, the threat to our homeland is growing. Homegrown radical terrorists are becoming the threat of the 21st century, and now is not the time to change the law that's been in place for decades. And I do hope people understand what this means. It means you would change the law so that if we caught somebody in America who went overseas to train and came back home, an American citizen who turned on the rest of us, no longer could you hold them as an enemy combatant and gather intelligence. And that, to me, would be a very dangerous thing to do. Now, Senator Kyle, who determines what the Constitution actually means? Is it the Congress or the Supreme Court?
Well, Mr. President, ultimately, the United States Supreme Court, when cases come before the court that present these issues, determines what the law is. And in this situation, we have actually two specific cases, and there are others that are tangential, that do clarify what the court believes the Supreme Court, what the Constitution would provide in this.
So the issue really is pretty simple. Our courts at the highest level, the Supreme Court, has acknowledged that the executive branch has the legal authority to hold an American citizen who's collaborating with an enemy as an enemy belligerent to gather intelligence and to protect the rest of us. They recognize that power of the executive. Do you agree with me that Senator Feinstein's amendment would be a situation where the Congress does not recognize that authority and would actually try to change it?
Yes, Mr. President, one of the questions is this interplay between the executive and the legislative branch. And when the legislative branch, as Congress has done here through the authorization of military force, has provided the legal basis for the administration to hold a person engaged in war against us, then it cannot be denied that that authority exists. There is a 1971 law that Congress passed that said you can hold people only pursuant to law, and this was the precise holding of the Hamdi case, where the U.S. Supreme Court said they had the authority because of the authorization of military force. So the executive has that authority, the legislature has provided the basis for the authority, and the Supreme Court has upheld it by its ultimate jurisdiction.
And just to conclude this colloquy, which I've really enjoyed the discussion, is that I'm not saying that our law enforcement, military intelligence community cannot read someone their Miranda rights. I'll leave that up to them. I am saying the Congress should not take off the table the ability to hold someone under the law of war to gather intelligence, and that's what we're about to do if this passes. So to those who believe that homegrown terrorists are a threat now and in the future, if you want to make sure we can never effectively gather intelligence, we only have one option, then that's what we're about to impose on the country.
And might I ask my colleagues just to yield for one last point that I'd like to make here. In a criminal trial, the object is to do justice to the individual as pertains to his alleged violation of law of the United States. In the case of the capture and detention of a combatant, someone who has taken action against the United States, the object first is to keep the United States safe from this individual's actions, and secondly, where possible, gain intelligence from that individual. That's the critical element that would be taken from our military were the Feinstein Amendment to be adopted. And I'd like unanimous consent to insert in the record at this point a statement that makes very clear why military detention is necessary to allow intelligence gathering that will prevent future terrorist attacks against the American people.
Is there objection? So ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I hope that this statement will clarify in anyone's minds the point that by taking people into military custody in the past, we have gathered essential intelligence to protect the American people. That's the reason for the detention in the first place, A, to keep the American people safe from further attack by the individual, and B, to gather this kind of intelligence. Nothing precludes the United States, the executive branch, from thereafter deciding to try the individual as a criminal in the criminal court with all of the attendant rights of a criminal. But until that determination, it cannot be denied that the executive has the authority to hold people as military combatants, gather intelligence necessary, and to hold that individual until the cessation of hostilities.
Senator's time has expired. Senior Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Mr. President, I understand we're still in morning business.
The time of morning business has expired.
I'd ask consent that I be recognized for another 5 minutes as in morning business, and the distinguished senator from Illinois be recognized for 10 minutes as in morning business.
Without objection. So ordered.
Mr. President, earlier this week, one of the bill's lead sponsors said here on the floor of the U.S. Senate, the bill's detention subtitle would authorize the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens at Guantanamo Bay. I found that a stunning statement. We should consider the ramifications of passing a bill containing this language. Supporters of the detention provisions in the bill continue to argue that such measures are needed, as they say, because we're a nation of war. Well, that does not mean that we should be a nation without laws or a nation that does not adhere to the principles of our Constitution. Many of us remember being told because of the terrible things that Saddam Hussein did to us on 9/11 and his weapons of mass destruction, we should go to war. Of course, it turned out he had nothing to do with 9/11 and no weapons of mass destruction, but we spent 10 years in a war and spent $1 trillion because of that. Let's stop and think about following what has protected us throughout our nation's history and our Constitution. One of the provisions in this bill, Section 1032, runs directly contrary to the principles of our laws. It requires the military to detain terrorism suspects, even those who might be captured on U.S. soil. Now, this provision is opposed by the very intelligence, military, and law enforcement officials who are entrusted with keeping our nation safe. These are the people who oppose it: the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, the Attorney General, the Director of the FBI, the President's top counterterrorism advisor. They say it doesn't help us, we shouldn't have it. And as Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I support the efforts of Senator Feinstein, the Chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, to modify Section 1032 so it doesn't interfere with ongoing counterterrorism efforts or undermine our constitutional principles. You know, we should, in our fight against al-Qaeda and other terrorist threats, give our intelligence, our military, and law enforcement professionals all the tools they need. I think we all agree with that. But the mandatory military detention provisions in Section 1032 actually limits those tools by tying the hands of the intelligence and law enforcement professionals who are fighting terrorism It creates operational confusion and uncertainty, and that's unwise and unnecessary. On Monday, the Director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, warned that Section 1032 would adversely affect the Bureau's ability to continue ongoing international investigations. Secretary Panetta stated unequivocally that this provision restrains the executive branch options to utilize in a swift and flexible fashion all the counterterrorism tools that are now legally available. Now, these aren't partisan objections. This is the Secretary of Defense, the Director of the FBI, both of whom were confirmed by this body with 100-0 votes. But these seem to be the voices we're supposed to ignore. Director Mueller stated in his letter the provisions are problematical. They fail to recognize the reality of a counterterrorism investigation. The Director of National Intelligence, Clapper, stated, and this is what we should think about in this debate, the various detention provisions, even with the proposed waivers, would introduce unnecessary rigidity in intelligence gathering process. Lisa Monaco, the Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division, stated that agents and prosecutors should not have to spend their time worrying about citizenship status and whether and how to get a waiver signed by the Secretary of Defense in order to thwart an al-Qaeda plot against the homeland. We don't listen to these people. And Senator Feinstein's amendment would ensure the requirement of military detention of terrorism suspects does not apply domestically. As chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I'm a proud co-sponsor of her position, and I support it. And, Mr. President, I ask my whole statement be made part of the record.